welcome to a little talk, conversation about queens and other benevolent dictators in open source communities. My name is Aeva Black.
My name is Hazel Weekly.
I am currently just kind of an itinerant open source cybersecurity consultant over here in Europe, but some of you might have known other roles I've had in the past. I'll just leave it at that.
I have thoughts, lots of thoughts. They never stop thinking, they never stop thinking. And I work in figuring out with the Nivenly Foundation as a fellow, helping open source communities be sustainable, happy and thriving, and figuring out how to help them scale that cliff between, I just threw some code on the internet, and what do you mean I have to figure out how to get all these people working together and make a project happy and healthy? Don't these things just grow themselves? And you know, that is a large cliff. And we don't have a lot of stuff out there helping us deal with it. And so I hope to try to figure that out.
So there's a bit of a disparity in how long we've both been doing open source. I started writing code professionally in 1999. I think my first formal open source contribution to a project was probably 2 years later, even though all the code I did before that was up on the internet, but it was available for anyone to use. And then my first talk at a conference was 2005. And so I've kind of, I don't know, seen a little bit.
I started writing code after that. I was in preschool in '99. So sorry about that. If I made you feel old, don't worry, you'll feel older. But one of the things that is interesting is, so in a complex kind of system, as things move, as things go on, as things change, even though things do change, it can feel like you're moving a giant boulder uphill, and the system just doesn't seem to be going anywhere. And then all of a sudden, it's like the boulder became liquid and things can just move. And there's this weird inflection point. And the cool thing about these inflection points is they happen in governments, they happen in the world, and they happen all the way down in your personal life as well. And so one thing that we both realize is we actually have a very large inflection point at around the same time in our career. And so I'd like to ask you, what were some of those very large inflection points for you around that 9-ish year mark in your career?
Thank you, Don. Around 9 years in my career, I sort of finished my second set of open source engagements. This was I was doing a bunch of MySQL stuff, and I was switching to Start OpenStack, and I'd seen the effect of mentorship on a team I helped train and bootstrap and then left behind when I switched companies. That team went on to be incredibly successful. And that was the first time that I could see not just a technical impact that I was making, writing code, giving it away, giving talks, but actually the people that I had worked with growing in their own career and getting promotions. And that was kind of nice. How about you?
So for me, I'll let you know when I get there. Just kidding. For me, the thing that I've seen in the career is I've started off as this, you enter the career and you just use the software or you write code, you are just participating in the community and you may not even be aware of all the parts of the community. And then at some point I kind of reached that first inflection point of going from that building things to actually truly building things and building things that are people going to use, not just consuming them. And one of the biggest points in my career where that happened is when I accidentally wrote the official GitHub Actions for the Haskell programming language. And by accidentally, I meant someone had a problem. And I said, sure, I could solve that in a day or two. And so I did. And then the entire community started using it. And I'm like, I didn't, what? What do you mean everybody's using this? And that was weird. And then at some point, another inflection point kind of happened where I had people that I knew, people that I looked up to, and they said, oh yes, I read your blog. And I'm like, you know that I exist? And they go, oh yes, your advice is very helpful. And I'm like, oh no. And then I had communities, and I had companies saying, oh yeah, we follow this, and this helps us plan and strategize. And I'm like, oh goodness, how do I do that? And then you become a mentor. And not even a mentor, but you become a mentor of mentors. You become this grand mentor And then people come to you later and they're like, hey, so I have a problem, but it's not my problem, it's my mentee's problem. And I'm like, oh, well, that's cool, but also let's figure that out together. And you start to see the ripples of influence. And as you leave projects and as you join projects and as projects die or as they transform into things or these changes start to happen and you see the impacts that you've made over your career rippling out like waves. And I realized, at that point, succession planning is really important for that. Because otherwise, as you work in a community, you're just going to do things and then it'll lurch in odd ways and you won't really be able to make the impact that you want have last. And so I struggled with that.
And it was a little bit after that 9-year mark for me, jumping into the early days of OpenStack, when some of my colleagues who were starting around the same time, working in those same early days, all collectively realized and learned from people who were ahead of us at the time, we should plan for that and try to build into the initial governance models of those projects necessary rotation of leadership, necessary training of new folks, and passing on the torch as a systemic function of the governance. CNCF, actually, when they were forming, was also folks we knew, who we spent time with, talking about what worked and didn't work, and passing on that knowledge. And I was just chatting with someone in between the talks about how different Linux Foundation projects or foundations have this model of copying the best parts of what works from another one when one is formed. This is, whether it's intentional or not, the process of passing on leadership knowledge. And somewhere around that second major inflection point for me, around 15 to 18 years in my career, is when I made the shift from code to policy, realizing that the degree of impact our code was having could no longer be solved just by mentoring or passing a torch or writing more code or doing governance of the nonprofits and the foundations, but actually we had to start thinking about how this affects much larger systems of companies, countries, and the world. And now, of course, the UN has been running this third year of sort of a global open source summit. So the ripples have been getting bigger and bigger over the past 30 years. So I want to jump to the next question with you. What does it mean to have continuity? Right?
So continuity is an interesting thing because it's one of those things where you think you have it, and then you realize you don't. And then you solve that, and then you go, okay, we definitely have continuity over here. And then you turn out you don't have continuity over here. And so you fix that one, and then the continuity in the original part breaks, and you realize you didn't even really know what continuity meant in the first place. And so like this continuity of, projects, continuity of the mission, of the vision, like the goal of the project. Maybe the project itself doesn't stay, but the ideas behind it do. Is that continuity? Or what about the continuity of maintainers? How do you make sure that your maintainers can actually continue and do what they do sustainably? Or whatever, maybe the maintainer moves on, but the project stays around. And you can't satisfy all of them or even necessarily figure out the solutions for all of them, but you can kind of figure out what continuity starts to look like. So maybe going back into that OpenStack a little bit, what did continuity look like for you?
So at the sort of top of the management pyramid of OpenStack, for lack of a better word, there were elections, and the tier below that there were elections, and the tier below that there were elections, but at some point in the social hierarchy, the further up you got, the less code you did. And that's not sustainable. If you were an engineer and you got there by being a good engineer, you kind of want to go back and write code again. And at the same time, a lot of the actual code depended on projects that had just one maintainer. And sometimes that ran into problems because maintainers burn out, maintainers win the lottery. Unfortunately,
they do?
I mean, I don't know. I don't think I know any that have. No, I do. I know a few. I mean, the startup lottery. Sometimes they work at a startup and then they cash out and they kind of check out and not writing code anymore. Yeah,
Good for them.
sometimes worse things happen too. And anyway, so continuity at a large project means having enough resilience that one maintainer, one developer can disappear for whatever reason, and the project as a whole can continue, can adapt. But continuity for an individual might mean how do we intentionally construct our own narrative over time? How do we grow in our careers? Can we stay with the same open source project when our career changes? I've known lots of folks who don't. Whether they get a new job, and the new job just doesn't give them any free time, or the new job tells them you can't contribute upstream, and they have to make the hard choice of like, I love this project, these are my friends that I hang out with on IRC or Slack or whatever, but I need to pay my bills. And so continuity for the self and continuity for the community sometimes end up in conflict, and that's especially hard right now where the world depends on tens of thousands of single maintainer projects. The XKCD comic, we all point at like, lib Nebraska, that one little block at the bottom. The problem is there's thousands upon thousands of those one little blocks with one maintainer maintaining it. And so continuity for the overall structure also starts to look a little bit fragile.
And so that brings up like a question to me where we have this idea of continuity. And we talk about this continuity and we talk about sustainability, and it feels like we kind of conflate the two a lot and sort of put them in the same bucket. But are they the same thing? Because a project might have continuity, but does it have that sustainability? And if it has sustainability, does it have continuity? Like, where does that difference kind of split out for you?
Yeah, I tend to think of sustainability for a project as a virtuous cycle of contributions, code, maybe money for resources if they've got a CI system they have to spend money on, and new ideas, new developers coming in. I'm hoping that legislation like the Cyber Resilience Act in Europe can kind of nudge companies to get a little bit more invested in maintaining upstream. That might help. But yeah, continuity versus sustainability. Continuity is what you plan for, sustainability is what you build.
I can see that. One of the other things that really comes to mind for me with that continuity and sustainability is the way I think about these systems is you have this tangled network of multiple layers of trade-offs. And if you over-index on one, you might not get the other. And if you over-index on the other, you might miss like this secret third option. And you can't actually get perfect continuity and sustainability. One might even come at the expense of another. Like, the continuity of a project's vision might make it show resistant to sustainability because it won't accept anything that deviates from that vision. And then you end up with, things forking, or it's hard. And so I think of it as if you have these different trade-offs, you have to figure out where that trade-off makes sense for you, and then bake that trade-off into how you think of the project changing, rather than how you think of it staying the same. It's how is it going to change and grow in a way that even if I don't predict the future, I look at it in the future and I go, this is pretty cool.
And an element of that, just trying to over-index on continuity, say continuity of who the maintainers are in an unchanging set, can lead to its own set of problems if they won't adapt to changing environment, changing needs, changing users, or changing community. And we've certainly seen some projects where the community ends up forking because some people are unwilling to be accepting, adapting, whatever, of the needs of other members of the community. And that's a real problem for the sustainability of those projects.
And then if you go too hard on sustainability, you might end up with a project that is so resilient to anybody being there or anybody being in charge. It's like, how does anything get done? Because it doesn't matter who's doing one, because nothing's getting done. But that's sustainable. No code, an empty repository. 100% sustainability.
I thought that was totally like the corporate slogan last year, no code. Like first there was, no cloud and there was no code.
I mean, no code
Serverless.
is really just someone else's code, right?
You mean AI? So one of the things that I think helps to build these on-ramps, of course, there are things like codes of conduct or good policies around making sure communities can sustain diverse contributors, but there's also this notion that I'm going to shamelessly steal from one of my mentors, mean time to dopamine. Right? If you're building a new community or you want to grow one of the things to index on is how long does it take a new contributor to get that happy aha moment where their first PR is open or their first test passes or their first contribution is accepted and then they see their name in the commit log. Like, how do you optimize your on-ramps for the quickest and easiest path to a new contributor being happy with their participation there? And that's a really key thing in every community I've seen. How much they index on that influences their sustainability over time.
And one thing like that is super important. And one thing that I see as a failure mode a lot of the time is when a project gets large enough to a certain extent that a lot of the maintainers and a lot of the energy can be found in things that are sustainable sort of outside of the project, like a team that's hired by a large company, and that team can contribute a ton of energy. You can get these on-ramps that did exist, and then at one point the on-ramps just sort of erode. And you can get, like I had a friend of mine who wanted to contribute to a project, and the contribution was a very meaningful, but one-line change in the documentation. And after about 4 months, 20 documents, 6 PRs, they gave up. And that's, a very large project. Everybody knows this project. And that's not even uncommon. I've seen that in dozens of projects to an extent. But they're sustainable. They have that continuity. They have figured things out. They have 9 pages of logos. But they didn't optimize for that mean time to do, or mean time to anything, really.
Yeah, inertia can kill a project. Inertia can be the Achilles heel of sustainability. If they grow too ossified, new contributors who want to be able to collaborate on new platforms or work together in different ways will gravitate somewhere else where they can get that social aspect that has always been part of a lot of, not saying all, but a lot of open source developers' experience is kind of like, in the old days on the internet in the 90s, probably the same today on Discord as it was back then on IRC. Like you find a place and you hang out with people there and you also write some cool code and then you all kind of go, yay, look, we made it work. But if you go to where those people are a lot of the time, and that's one of the, challenges I see with a lot of projects is they're not embracing the mean time to dopamine for a different community.
And even if they do have that time to dopamine, or they do have these things that they're working on to make it easy to contribute, a lot of the time what I see is projects or communities focusing on what's that happy path? What is the success path when everything works out? And you might have a project that has 3 easy steps to contribute. Step 1, be happy. Step 2, find something you want to do. Step 3, just do it. But then what happens when you disagree? Or what happens when you have this, a term, social dilemma? And a project might have a social dilemma for many, many reasons. Some of those could be things from, we like this style guide to this one. It's shocking how many projects have died because of, formatting issues or opinions, or why? Anyway. But you might also have larger social dilemmas how do we as a project be sustainable if we're worried that we will be forked by a very large, massive company that can just run us into the ground for free because it costs them pennies to bankrupt us? And how do we protect against that? And then you've seen that in people doing license changes, and that's been controversial, but what else do people do? Or maybe you have this other social dilemma of how do we get this really, really expensive thing in that requires cooperation from a whole bunch of different companies, a whole bunch of different interests, and a whole bunch of different people that don't necessarily want to cooperate with each other, or may even be incentivized not to? How do we handle the social dilemmas and the unhappy parts of a community? And it turns out like this conflict resolution, problem resolution, is so integral to the health of a community that it actually is more central to a community than the actual, the happiness element, because it helps define what happiness looks like.
Yeah, and conflict resolution, I mentioned earlier, like the sustainability, sorry. The thing I mentioned earlier about like the continuity of self, the growth of self, conflict resolution also happens at a lot of different scales. Sometimes in a project between two people over punctuation, and sometimes between nations.
Right. And that's a huge, huge scale. Like, we're talking about, this conflict might be able to be resolved in one email, versus this conflict might be able to be resolved by maybe a small war or 4 decades. And how do you balance that? How do you think about that?
I mean, political tensions are certainly growing a little bit lately. And one of the things I've been trying to prevent for a while is fragmentation of open source. But I don't know, we are reaching a point as a global society is with the only parallels I can come up with to the kind of conflicts that are coming up now and surfacing through open source communities are once in 100-year milestones. The way automobiles changed the world, the way the printing press changed the world. And those took decades to sort out. And I think a lot of open source is going through something similar right now, where nations have realized that this is critical to national infrastructure. And some of the impacts of communities failing or individuals trying to take their role as a maintainer in a different direction, take a political stance that way, has really reshaped the way everyone has to think about open source. If your product is used by everyone, like your GitHub action. Your GitHub action that you mentioned earlier, the Haskell community, went from like just you solving a problem to suddenly the entire community using it. Right.
And then like now, if someone wants to fundamentally say change the API that involves, it becomes, it was originally a very, very cheap thing, and now it's a, very costly cooperative effort. And a, cooperative effort that's deeply costly requires everybody to buy in really hard and then not chicken out. And, or, not back away, or you need this reciprocity, and the notion of that reciprocity of, hey, if I put a ton of effort into this, if I sink entire organizations or if I write policy for a government that latches in to this path for years or maybe even decades, and then halfway through, the whole thing fizzles out, what does that mean for maybe even the health of an entire nation or an entire collective of nations?
So how do you as a contributor or as someone who's also sustaining communities think about that inflection point, which I think is pretty common to a lot of contributors' journeys, from I'm solving my problems, I'm solving problems for my friends. Oh, some companies care about this. Hey, everyone's using it. Why is a country I don't like also using it? And how do I feel about people I don't like benefiting from my code? That was one of my inflection points during the OpenStack days, when I realized I wasn't just solving problems that were helping, researchers at universities or CERN do cool science, but also global militaries were using the same code. I think right now a lot of open source developers weren't ready for those kinds of inflection points, and communities are feeling the shock. What do we do about that?
So that is something that I don't think we have like clear, easy answers for because it's not clear or easy. But one thing that I do think about is if you have this sort of common pool or this resource, like public infrastructure is one of them, critical infrastructure, like it's a common pool. It's a thing that the entire society collectively contributes to and uses from. And it turns out that a common pool that everybody is happy about, that is healthy, sustainable, and that can be used for the benefit of the community, whatever that benefit means, we don't necessarily know how to get there because there's no one path for it. But we do know what a healthy and vibrant common pool looks like. And Elinor Ostrom, for example, has done a lot of research on this internationally, multiple communities, multiple contexts over 30 years, and has found out that there are about 10 different-ish properties of what this looks like. And if you look at most open source communities, they don't satisfy the criteria of having asked these questions and figured out what that means for them. So like one of them is, do you have a clear idea of your users? And do you have a clear idea of like who can use this and who is contributing to it and what roles they play? And it turns out that so many contributors run into this dilemma of, do I accept a random pull request? And how do I make this pull request that I don't want? How do I reject it kindly? And if, before that even happened, you just sat down and said, here's what users are. Here's what this does. This software runs on Linux. If you submit a patch for Windows, sorry. And you can avoid everything before that. Or maybe you might say, this software only runs on Tuesdays. Don't know why you would, but you could do it. You could define what your users are. And there's about 9 other properties. And one of them that I find really important is this notion of polycentric governance, where it turns out no matter how big the community is, it's not the only one.
I suspect, could you define that for us?
So polycentric, is many centers. So you have your community, you have like your bubble, but at some point there's another community. And they may be using that project, or they may be building a different project that's like that. Or you're not the only thing in the entire universe. There are other people, other software, other needs, it's a complex system of many agents. And you are simply one of them.
Yeah, I think a few very large open source foundations try to include certain sets of stakeholders in their governance model, but I don't see that everywhere, and I don't see that in a lot of small ones, and it sort of happens implicitly sometimes. But I've not seen it articulated anywhere else the same way that this paper does. So could you remind the audience the name, and remind me the name, because I have it stashed, but I forgot the name of that paper. I think it really is useful.
The name of the paper?
Or the authors or something, so we can look it up, because we don't have slides to show you, but it is a cool paper worth reading on the question of how do you assess the governance of a project for sort of ecosystem longevity in the same way that anthropologists would look at an ecosystem's health.
Yeah. The name of the paper is roughly something about revisiting Elinor Ostrom's principles. And if you look up her thesis, she has a really nice Nobel Prize acceptance speech on YouTube. But then there's a paper that summarizes all of that in text form in a very, very nice way. And you can look at all of this, and it has a huge amount of grounding information to find things to pull out and to think about and use that to start to tackle some of these problems. Like one of the other things that it brings up very clearly is it turns out, you can't have a single set of rules that apply universally in context. Like what we talked about, nation-state level problems and, format and tooling level problems. Those are different. Mm-hmm. And there's not a single nation-state in the world that will accept via linter government policy. You need different rules for different scale. And you might have one country or one area having rules that make sense. Like you don't drive on the left side of the road everywhere in the world.
The same is true in open source projects. You don't build the same code if you want it to run on a microcontroller and a million node supercomputer cluster. You write different code, you configure it differently for a different purpose. The same is true for project governance. You design your governance, you should, differently depending on the size, and then adapt if the community needs to grow. One of the other things I took away from that paper is the need for feedback loops where different stakeholders feel that they have a stake, they have representation, and they have participation. And there isn't a single open source community I've ever worked in that actually met all 10 criteria that the paper outlines, which was a pretty big aha moment for me in reading it. Like, this is how anthropologists look at ecosystems. Why aren't we? I know some people are, but I don't know. Yeah, I thought that was interesting. I do want to save a few minutes for questions. I think we have 10 minutes left. Cool.
That's incredible. I'm timeline, so just getting the time right on anything.
Yeah, we're doing great. We're doing great.
Nice.
We totally prepared for this, actually, with like time blocks for everything. So we actually are on our schedule. I want to close just with one thought that we talked about ecosystems a bit, and a very dear friend of ours loved mountain climbing, mountain hiking. And so like hiking in the mountains, going it alone is a lot cheaper and easier to organize. But you really can't go as far. If we want public infrastructure scale, sovereign, digital sovereignty in Europe or anywhere, to be sustainable, we're going to have to find ways to encourage and sustain the cost of cooperative efforts. So,
Questions?
So going to something that you both mentioned, the individual in Nebraska and your Haskell actions, you've got a scenario where, usually when someone is looking and they are in a solo maintainer environment, they're usually looking for people. But what are your thoughts on the obligations of someone who has potentially made a project, whether as a hobby or intentional or just come up with something, and then suddenly everybody else adopted it, and now the world has put obligation to potentially have continuity and other maintainers and make something larger than it was intended to be?
The answer to this is going to have implications here in Europe under some new laws. In particular, I don't think that the person who just chose to publish some code is inherently responsible for what people do with that code. The people who are downloading it and using it are. However, certain language ecosystems, I could name names, but you all probably know which ones I mean, don't really allow for easy responsibility taking by the consumer because they encourage taking a dependency on the public distribution channel directly. If you just go change that Haskell action and suddenly a dozen companies' CI systems break and their products now have disasters and whatnot, you didn't know, you had no way of knowing. I would say those companies shouldn't have taken the dependency directly on it, but that's not how GitHub works. So it's a platform problem.
You also have this kind of fuzzy difference between, say, obligation, which is in some context a very specific word, and then reciprocity of, oh hey, if I do this and I trust you, then that trust has to be in the form of a bidirectional trust. It's not just the word trust thrown into the air. It's trust in that mutuality, and both of you engage in a way that's beneficial for both of you. But blending between that and obligation and figuring out how to get both can sometimes be, to Ava's point, really, really tricky.
Yeah, thank you both for this. This is a great conversation. So my question is so when you put these structures in place to kind of prevent some of these problems or kind of cause these kind of sustainable ecosystems, do you have any thoughts about how to balance that or how to prevent that from becoming bureaucracy in and of itself, right? How to prevent that from becoming the barrier, because you have to now learn all this, all this stuff. I don't know.
It's a trade-off. It really is, right? If you want to go far, you plan for the journey, you build a team, you plan your routes, you have your backups, you maybe set up way stations. In the same way, if you want a community that builds very large-scale projects, the infrastructure to do that will need people to run it. If you want to enable companies or broader to depend on it for the long term, for the next 30 years, you need to build the bureaucracy to help sustain for 30 years or longer. That's the cost of making it sustainable. We have a few examples in curl. I've seen Daniel Stenberg give some great talks on the challenges as the one person who wrote curl and still writes curl. With now a sizable team that helps make it go, these projects still have challenges. What happens when projects like that, where there is one figurehead, and that person wants to stop doing that? What happens? And with everybody depending on it, it's going to be interesting. I think just the bureaucracy is the cost of doing business.
One of the other things that I think can be challenging is that we do have in the quote real world some examples of kind of figuring this out, like public infrastructure for transportation. And it's easy to contribute to that. You pay some magical amount of money in taxes, you have some magical amount of money in fares, and then as a consumer of this, you just never have to worry about anything else ever. And the fact that there's, whole teams and companies and regulations and laws and all this hidden complexity gets boiled down to a tiny little number somewhere. But getting to that point took us, 8,000 years or something? And we're trying to speedrun that with open source in, 20, plus or minus, 4,000 years. But, probably we're hoping for 20. And it turns out really hard because open source doesn't have a lot of these, in the digital world, doesn't have a lot of these really nice things that make it easy, like constraints. It's, impossible to go faster than the speed of light, but that's about it. Everything else is just ones and zeros. Whereas the physical world, you can't run your car through a building. You can't run a train, underground. Forever, you run into, the middle of the earth. You can't do that. So you have these constraints, and it makes it easier to figure out how to build something that's sustainable and understandable. We know how to contribute to it because you can see it. But here, we're going to have to figure out not just how to build this network and the complexity of things you can contribute to, but how to make this mysterious, ethereal world understandable to people who don't necessarily want to even see it. Or even if they do, they couldn't.
And back to I briefly mentioned the sort of historical moments we're going through. If you think of the inflection point for the world's dependence on open source, as it parallels, say, the world's dependence on the combustion engine rather than the steam engine, and how much that transformed cities and public life, we're about 30 years in, and the Model T is still on the road. We now have a couple countries, a couple national groups, saying seatbelts should be mandatory in cars. And the manufacturer is saying, we don't agree on what seatbelts are, let alone, who pays for the roads. To Hazel's point, trains today, I can just tap a card and walk on a train and they're mostly running and my phone will tell me if they're going to be late. But it took a long time to build the bureaucracy, the knowledge, and the rigor to sustain that. We're living through that with open source right now.
Hello. Thank you. Very interesting conversation. I have a bit more practical question about governance. I help open source software projects with their governance, and what I always try is to start, because it's a hard subject. Often engineers do not see the necessity of it or think it's very easy. So I try to always start with just write down what's the current situation. And then from there, I try to really iteratively, really small improvements. That is working but hard. So do you have any good experiences on how to get the community with you in such governance process and how to improve it functionally?
I think most developers want the quickest path to dopamine, and thinking about signing a CLA is like, well, it's a little cost in the way of getting to committing code, but trying to get them to think about writing the CLA and what terms should be in there to enable a good IP policy for the project's longevity or the foundation to be able to accept donations, they don't want to think about that. They really don't. Framing it as enabling them or helping to pay for the things that sustain their work, like getting donations to keep the CI system running or whatever it might be, or cool stickers, right? Open source karma, like giving them some little thing that, again, dopamine, you get a t-shirt, you get a sticker or whatever. There's lots of little ways to incentivize it, but yeah, it's a hard one. It's a service that doesn't usually get rewarded well until you're playing with corporate boards, and then you're not talking to open source anymore, you're talking to big companies and their lawyers. I do want to pass the mic to you, but also someone do a time check. We had the door open twice just now. Are we over time? Yes. Okay.
Apologies to people outside the door. So one of the things that I do think about when it comes to like incentivizing is I did bring it up a little bit earlier, but incentivizing and this reward and the dopamine structure is important, but the conflict resolution, it turns out, is more central to the longevity of a project and the health of it. So one of the things, as an analog to that might be, sure, you might have a report card, you might have the dopamine of, oh, people can contribute to this really easily, but I don't want to write the funding page. And I don't want to write all these other things. And so someone might come in, they might say, as a contributor from a large company, I have to have a very clear security document that details how you deal with security vulnerabilities. When's the last time you've ever seen a developer frothing at the mouth, enthusiastic about writing documentation? Doesn't happen. So the conflict resolution doesn't necessarily have to be a conflict. But how do you get community able to accept that? The term conflict resolution can sometimes bring up more research that can be relevant than the incentive structure. And so looking for both of them and finding the two sides of the coin can help with that. But there's no easy magical answers. And we should definitely not take any more questions. So thank you very much.